Ron Ellis might not be the flashiest name among hockey legends, but his story carries an intensity that runs far deeper than goals and assists. He wasn't just a workhorse right winger for the Toronto Maple Leafs. He was also a man who battled a silent enemy that nearly ended his career, and at one point threatened to unravel everything he'd worked for. We're talking about depression, a condition that today we recognize as common and treatable, but back in the 1970s, it was a taboo topic, especially in the rough-and-tumble world of the NHL. In a sport filled with high-impact hits, missing teeth, and locker room bravado, owning up to something like anxiety or crippling sadness was almost unthinkable. And yet, that was Ron Ellis's reality. Imagine a small-town kid from Lindsay, Ontario, population not exactly city-sized, growing up in a family of modest means. His dad worked the railroad. His mom made sure the kid stayed on the straight and narrow. Young Ron developed his love for hockey on outdoor rinks, the kind where you'd hear the scrape of skates against fresh ice at dawn, your breath turning to steam in the winter air. He showed enough promise to end up with the Toronto Marlboros, a top junior team linked to the Maple Leafs. This was back in the early 1960s when the NHL was still the tight-knit Original Six, and because the Leafs sponsored him, he was signed straight away. No need for a draft. At first glance, that might sound like a fairy tale come true. A direct pipeline to the pros from your junior team, a shot at stardom in the big league. But as we'll see, that dream was far more complicated. Ellis broke into the NHL in the 1963-64 season, playing a single game at age 19 before heading back to the juniors. He didn't even have time to soak in the atmosphere of an NHL locker room before he was on a bus home. But the Leafs saw a spark in him, something that balanced goal-scoring skill with the maturity to handle defensive duties. By 1964-65, he was a full-time Maple Leaf, scoring 23 goals and turning heads for his quiet consistency. And quiet is an important descriptor here. Ellis was never a big talker, never the center of drama. He just showed up, put in the work, and let his on-ice performance speak for itself. That approach dovetailed nicely with an era when the Maple Leafs were still formidable contenders for the Stanley Cup. The old guard, guys like Dave Keon, Frank Mahovlich, George Armstrong, were the superstars, while Ellis settled into a supporting role. But you can't label him a mere passenger. In 1967, the Leafs faced the powerhouse Montreal Canadiens in the Cup final. Despite being the underdogs, Toronto pulled off a 6-game triumph, and Ron Ellis was right there in the trenches. He potted a couple of goals in the playoffs, but more importantly, he shut down Montreal's top scorers. This was the Leafs' last Cup victory to date, and over half a century later, that 1967 championship still resonates like a mythic event for fans. Ellis, all of 22 years old at the time, became a piece of that legend. Yet, as he blossomed into an established NHLer, scoring 20-plus goals in 6 different seasons, and eventually hitting a personal high of 35 goals in 1969-70, beneath that calm exterior, something else was brewing. The pressure of playing in a hockey-mad market like Toronto was overwhelming in itself. You're not just dealing with the typical stress of performing in a top league, you're also shouldering the hopes of an entire city starved for success. The Maple Leafs brand is iconic, and the fans can be merciless if you fail to deliver. For Ellis, a player who had always prided himself on reliability, this pressure could be crushing. He wasn't the type to blow off steam in the locker room or rant to reporters. Instead, he pushed all that stress down, told himself to keep going, to keep producing. As the seasons piled on, so did the internal strain. The 1970s arrived, and so did more responsibility for Ellis. He'd racked up accolades like 4 All-Star Game appearances, further proof of his two-way excellence. He had 6 20-goal seasons under his belt. You'd think that, from the outside looking in, everything was perfect. Here was a guy who seemed to have it all: a stable roster spot, respect from his peers, a Stanley Cup ring. But that was the era of stoicism. If you felt depressed or anxious, words that some coaches or teammates might have sneered at in that day, you simply soldiered on. No one wanted to look weak. Mental health resources were minimal, and the slightest hint of emotional vulnerability might be interpreted as lacking toughness. Imagine being a professional athlete in that environment, battling an invisible enemy that told you weren't good enough, that the expectations were too high, that you couldn't possibly keep living up to them. At some point in the early to mid-1970s, Ellis realized something was deeply off. He started to struggle with a persistent heaviness that wouldn't lift, no matter how many times he laced up for practice. There were days he dreaded going to the rink, dreaded the sound of the whistle, the demands to block shots, bury chances, or throw a hit when needed. He felt burned out. And in an era when you're expected to be grateful just to wear an NHL sweater, burned out wasn't in the lexicon. Yet that's exactly where he found himself. People around him might have noticed changes in his demeanor, maybe less laughter, more moments standing alone in the corner of the locker room, a little slump in his posture. But even if they recognized the signs, there wasn't a robust understanding of mental health in the hockey world back then. By 1975, Ellis's mental struggles had risen to crisis levels. He shocked Toronto fans and even some of his teammates by announcing he was walking away from the game. To the media, the storyline was that he wanted to focus on his sporting goods business in Lindsay, or that maybe he was wrestling with the Leafs front office. In truth, the biggest battle was internal. He was dealing with clinical depression, a condition that made it nearly impossible for him to find joy in daily life, let alone the intense rigors of an NHL season. At the time, such an admission could tank your reputation. You might be labeled as not tough enough or not grateful for your opportunity. But Ellis, at that breaking point, made the painful choice to step off the ice. It was either that, or continue to deteriorate in plain view of thousands of fans every night. The real tragedy is that in those days, depression was seen as something you could just shake off, especially if you were in a macho environment like pro hockey. People might say, "What do you have to be depressed about? You're in the NHL. You won a Stanley Cup. You make good money, and you're famous." But that's not how depression works. You can have every outward sign of success and still feel isolated and hopeless. Ellis realized that the unrelenting demands of the Maple Leafs and the expectations of an entire hockey-crazed city weren't going to let up. So he left, not fully sure if he'd ever return. He took time to try to heal, but the therapy landscape was sparse, and mental health was rarely spoken of in an empathetic way. This wasn't just a hiatus from hockey either. This was a life-or-death matter in some respects. Depression can be debilitating, pushing people to the brink when it goes untreated. Ellis found himself grappling with questions that overshadowed anything that could happen on the ice. Who am I if I'm not a hockey player? What's my worth if the fans in the Maple Leafs don't rely on me to score 20 goals a season? A mind swirling with these doubts can sink further and further if it doesn't find solid ground. His store, Ron Ellis Sports, became a partial distraction, at times a lifeline. But he still felt the burden of letting down fans, teammates, even himself. Meanwhile, the Maple Leafs soldiered on without him, stumbling in the ever-competitive NHL. Some fans speculated about his retirement. Was he just tired of losing? Did he have a falling out with management? Few considered the possibility that, underneath that stoic surface, Ellis was battling an invisible illness that had stolen his desire to play. But gradually, he began to see a glimmer of hope. Through counseling, which was quite forward-thinking at the time, and the support of his wife, Jan, he began to realize that depression wasn't a moral failing. It was a medical condition, one that he could tackle with the right tools. He wasn't weak, he was human. Taking that first step, acknowledging the need for help, was probably the bravest moment of his life, overshadowing any scoreboard heroics. By 1977, Ellis managed a comeback that, in hindsight, was nothing short of miraculous. He returned to the Leafs lineup for the 1977-78 season. Some fans doubted whether he still had the speed and accuracy that had once made him a 35-goal scorer. Wasn't he 33 years old and over the hill? Hadn't he abandoned the team once already? But he was determined to prove not just to skeptics, but to himself, that he could still play elite hockey. That season, he racked up 26 goals and 26 assists for 52 points in 80 games, a statistic that might not lead the league, but was more than respectable in an era less focused on freewheeling offense. More importantly, it proved that a battle with depression didn't have to end a career. In fact, Ellis's personal triumph in that season soared above any single game highlight. His depression, while better managed, didn't magically vanish. Mental illness rarely does. But Ellis had tools now: therapy, the support of his family, and a growing understanding within himself that winning the struggle didn't mean you never felt the darkness again. It meant you learned how to live with it, how to spot warning signs, how to talk about it, if possible, and how to let loved ones step in. That was a massive change in a league where players typically kept emotional issues under lock and key. Ellis's willingness to discuss it, even quietly at first, broke ground for future players who might have faced the same feelings of despair. He continued to play for Toronto until 1981, building on the career totals that still impress Maple Leafs fans today. 1,034 games, all with the same franchise, plus 332 goals and 308 assists. He retired at 36, older than many players at the time, but in better mental shape than when he'd walked away in 1975. After he stepped away from playing for good, Ellis began taking on new roles, first in business, though his store faced ups and downs, then in positions connected to hockey, like a community ambassador for the Leafs. Eventually, he joined the Hockey Hall of Fame as a director of public affairs, working behind the scenes to promote the heritage of a sport he had once lost the passion for. The irony is that now, with a clearer head, he found new excitement in celebrating hockey's history and forging stronger ties between fans, former players, and the Hall. Behind the scenes, Ellis never forgot his own journey with depression. He might not have broadcast it with a megaphone, but he was always ready to lend an ear if a younger player confided in him, or if he recognized a look in someone's eyes that said, "I'm struggling." Over time, as society's understanding of mental health evolved, he opened up more publicly. In 2002, he released an autobiography called Over the Boards, the Ron Ellis Story, in which he candidly shared the anguish he'd gone through. For fans used to seeing Ellis as the polite, diligent guy who rarely made headlines, this revelation was striking. Some were startled that a hockey player, particularly one who wore the Maple Leafs emblem, could ever be so vulnerable. Others were relieved. Maybe they recognized themselves in Ellis's account. Maybe it made them feel less alone. Modern readers see him as a pioneer, someone who faced down mental health issues when few in sports had the courage to do so. Ellis's story demonstrates a broader truth. Professional athletes, no matter how strong or stoic they appear on the ice, are human. Depression doesn't discriminate based on your job title, your net worth, or how many adoring fans chant your name. If you're struggling internally, you can't simply slap on a helmet and skate away from it. Ellis learned that the hard way, but in the end, he turned that painful lesson into a life-affirming path. After his retirement, he channeled that understanding into charity work, partnering with organizations like the Canadian Mental Health Association. He used his platform to spark dialogues that would have been unthinkable in the 1970s. People started realizing that if a cup-winning Maple Leaf could come forward about his mental health, maybe it was okay for them to talk about theirs too. His message resonates with a modern audience more than ever. We watch current NHL players take mental health days or speak openly about anxiety, and it feels progressive. But let's not forget that guys like Ron Ellis were forging that path decades ago, when the concept was so misunderstood it could derail your career. He's a living testament to the idea that depression doesn't have to claim your identity or your dreams. It's a formidable foe, yes, but not unbeatable. When you remember that this same man once had to walk away from hockey altogether just to survive, it becomes clear how much he gave back once he returned. Imagine stepping back into the Maple Leafs dressing room as a 33-year-old after effectively quitting the sport and regaining the trust of teammates, staff, and fans. That alone is enough to make him legendary. Moreover, his time away from the rink wasn't just about personal healing. It shaped how he'd approach life post-NHL. Many athletes struggle after retirement, their sense of identity so wrapped up in the game that they don't know who they are without it. Ellis, through his battle with depression, had already gone through a confrontation of, who am I beyond hockey? So, when the second retirement in 1981 came around, it wasn't as devastating as it could have been. Yes, it was an adjustment, but he had the advantage of having done that inner work. He would go on to champion various business and philanthropic efforts. The Maple Leafs welcomed him for alumni events, charity games, hospital visits. He was precisely the kind of ambassador the franchise wanted, polite, gracious, and deeply connected to the city's hockey roots. He also kept a special place in his heart for Lindsay, Ontario. That's where it all started, where the little boy on the frozen pond dreamed of playing in the big leagues. Residents there treat him like a hometown hero. The local arena has featured tributes to him, and each time he shows up to sign autographs or attend a community function, there's a line out the door. They might remember the bullet points: Stanley Cup champion, 1,034 games, 332 goals, but it's often the intangible stuff that really resonates. People talk about his kindness, how he speaks softly, how he never brags about his achievements, and how he's always open to chat about the old days. The humility that once kept him from complaining about the monstrous pressure of Toronto also made him an enduring figure long after he left the ice. We also can't ignore Ellis's role in the 1972 Summit Series, arguably the biggest international moment in Canadian hockey history, before the modern era of Olympic best-on-best competitions. Team Canada's showdown with the Soviet Union tested the pride and skill of the best NHL players. Ellis played in 3 games, focusing mainly on the defensive aspects, shutting down the fearsome Soviet scorers, though he joked he could never quite catch up to Valery Kharlamov. He didn't fill the stats sheet, but his presence underscored the trust coaches had in his reliable two-way game. With Canada eking out a dramatic series win, Ellis became part of another permanent marker in hockey lore. The fact that he was dealing with mounting personal pressures around that same time only underscores how mentally strong he was on the surface, even as he struggled internally. In later years, as the sport advanced, more people began to talk about what Ellis had quietly gone through. In 2002, when his autobiography dropped, the conversation finally had a platform. Modern fans, accustomed to hearing about sports psychologists and mental performance coaches, might view Ellis's earlier hush-hush ordeal as heartbreaking, but also strangely heroic. This was a man who faced darkness at a time when no one was handing out instructions on how to cope. He had to find his own way. Yes, it nearly destroyed him. Yes, it nearly ended his playing career too soon. But the remarkable aspect is that it didn't succeed. He came back stronger, not necessarily in terms of goals scored, though that 1977 to 1978 season was impressive, but stronger in self-awareness. That kind of fortitude is rare in any human being, let alone a professional athlete who's already under the constant glare of cameras and critical fans. Even after stepping away from the NHL as a player, Ellis stayed connected to the community. He took a position at the Hockey Hall of Fame, serving as Director of Public Affairs and helping elevate the prestige of the shrine where hockey's greatest are enshrined. It's poetic in a way that a man who was once overshadowed by bigger personalities and flashier stats eventually took up an authoritative role in preserving the game's history. He could share the intangible stories that shaped hockey, not just the bullet points of goals and trophies. Meanwhile, his mental health advocacy continued, albeit more quietly, as he spoke to youths and adults alike about the importance of opening up, seeking therapy, and not letting cultural norms about toughness keep them from getting help.